Hi, everyone. Welcome
Hey, partner.
to session 13 of Introduction to the Hebrew Bible. Liberation found as we continue our journey through Exodus. I did enjoy the break we had over the past few weeks as we did the book study, but I was very much looking forward to being back with you all today and digging deeply once more into these Old Testament texts. So thanks for being here with me and with us all. Um, the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. It is truly right and good, always and everywhere, with our whole heart and mind and voice, to praise you, the invisible, almighty, and eternal God, and your only begotten Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. For he is the true Paschal Lamb, who at the feast of the Passover paid for us the debt of Adam's sin, and by his blood delivered your faithful people. This is the night when you brought our fathers, the children of Israel, out of bondage in Egypt and led them through the Red Sea on dry land. This is the night when all who believe in Christ are delivered from the gloom of sin and are restored to grace and holiness of life. This is the night when Christ broke the bonds of death and hell and rose victorious from the grave. Amen. This, of course, is, you recognize it perhaps from the Exultet, the great song of praise, ancient song of praise that the deacon sings to the Paschal flame, the great vigil of Easter every year. And I love it for many reasons, but particularly for the way it connects us with the Exodus narrative that we're currently working through, particularly today's story as we move through the Exodus itself. So as a review, a few review items to kind of get you caught up and remind you where we are. There are three texts that are our foundational texts we're using in this class. The version of the Bible I'm using is the New Oxford Annotated Bible, NRSV with Apocrypha. The kind of basic one volume study commentary, which is a good one, which is very, very helpful, is How to Read the Bible Book by Book by Fee and Stewart. And then each book we work through, there'll be a specific commentary for that book that I'm going to be drawing from. And for the Exodus, I'm using the commentary from the interpretation series that is by Terence Fretheim. And so if you want to dig more deeply into the book of Exodus, that would be the text I would commend to you. Any questions about any of that? Okay. So let's just remember let's see what you can remember from a month ago about this whole request for liberation, which is what we did in our last session, in session 12. So remember how the oppression functions theologically in Exodus, particularly chapter 5. God is on the side of the disadvantaged because God opposes injustice. That's kind of core to God's being. Pharaoh seeks to get the oppressed to rely on him. He calls them lazy. He blames them for their own oppression. All of these are trademarks of oppressors throughout history. He also turns some of the slaves into collaborators by making them foremen, thereby dividing and conquering. And the system is working because they're in this horribly oppressive system of slavery, but the people are complaining to the foreman. The foreman are complaining to Moses, but no one is complaining that the actual oppression itself is the injustice that needs to change. And that's where Moses enters the picture, is to be that person, so to remind you of what's going on theologically here. Moses steps into the breach to be the person of God who opposes the injustice itself. Except Moses, like I said, who complains to God to fix it, and then that is when God responds to ensure that liberation occurs. Remember the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. This question, did Pharaoh have free will if God kept hardening his heart? And we kind of traced our way through these, if you remember, in chronological order. Pharaoh's heart was hardened, is hardened, remained hardened. He hardened his heart. His heart was hardened. Hardened his heart this time also, was hardened. So by the end of the fifth plague, it's not God hardened Pharaoh's heart. It's either Pharaoh doing it himself, or it's a passive voice, leaving God out of the picture. After the fifth plague, then we get the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. And then Pharaoh sinned once more and hardened his heart. his heart was hardened, and then the final three, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart 3 times. The key, remember, is in the ritual remembrance in Exodus 13:15. When Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, when that happened, that's what they remember, that God predicted Pharaoh would harden his heart. And at the end, God continued Pharaoh's choice so that God's creative power could be seen and that Yahweh could be known. So who hardened Pharaoh's heart is Pharaoh. And then God continued that choice so that God's power could be manifest. So it's kind of some of the things we were picking up and doing in our last. Does all of that, any of that ring a bell to you, or are you sitting there thinking, oh my goodness, I have no idea what's going on?
Just one little comment, and that is that at verse 35, so the heart of Pharaoh was hardened. That's a passive voice. So it's not saying that Pharaoh hardened his heart. It was hardened by someone else.
Yeah, by someone or by something. It could have been by the circumstances. And we saw that as well in verse 7:13 and verse 8:19 and chapter 9, verse 7.
But it has been kind of a pattern so far of God's doing the hardening.
Yeah, well, but God is not used as the noun clearly until all the way down to chapter 9 is the first time it said that the Lord is the one doing the hardening. That was the point.
My kids used to use the passive voice when they didn't want to take responsibility. They never said, I broke it. They say, it broke.
Right,
it
yeah.
Broken.
I had in my very first graduate school class in Old Testament was with, what was his name? John T. Willis. This guy's a genius, studied at Harvard. There's a class of scholars from the Churches of Christ that went to Harvard and Princeton. They were the first Ivy League scholars in the denomination I was raised in, and he was one of them. And I remember I done, pretty well. I graduated summa cum laude with a minor in biblical languages. Like most people going into an MDiv don't have a background in biblical studies. They have some other undergraduate degree, and they're kind of but I'm like, I've got this down pat. And I got my first paper back from him, and I got a C. And it was bleeding with red ink. And constantly, the constant refrain was passive voice. Stop using the passive voice. Poor English. Stop using the passive voice. So I still do it sometimes in my writing because it's a bad tick. But John Willis tried very hard to flail it out of me with his red pen. But I think, to your point, Carolyn, I do think that the passive voice is often used as a way of escaping culpability. And so, what's doing the hardening? What is the actual nominative in that sentence, whether it's the circumstances or some other unknown factor, we don't know. But the point being that we don't see the Lord specifically hardening Pharaoh's heart until we're already halfway through the plagues, before that becomes explicit. All right. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about plague and Passover. We're going to be looking tonight at Exodus 12 through 15, as I said in my email. So far, much of the genre, remember we talked about reading the text according to its genre? So in the same way, when you read if any of you remember what it was like, so they used to have these things called newspapers. They would come to your house, big sheets of paper. I don't know if you believe it or not. This is true.
It still happens.
Do they still exist?
Yes, they do.
It's someone that writes for one regularly. I should probably know that. But that when you read the newspaper, you don't read news the same way you read sports. In fact, probably some of you might even be baseball fans, and you could look at a graph of a baseball game with no pros, and you could tell me exactly what happened in that game. Could any of you do that? Know how to read baseball scores like that?
A graph?
Well, it's got like where it tells you what happened in each inning, and this where it's literally just like
kind of like a box score.
Yeah, like a box score. If you don't know how to read a box score, that just like a bunch of numbers. But if you know how to read a box score, it tells you a lot about a baseball game, right, Chuck?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, a tremendous amount. So in the same way, we're reading the Bible, we have to pay attention to the genre we are reading. That we can't read it all the same. The genre of prose, which we've been doing, narrative, is different than law, than ritual, than wisdom, than satire. You know, I don't know if you've ever had the experience of watching someone share something on Facebook or Twitter that was posted by Babylon Bee or The Onion, and they think it's real. So The Onion and Babylon Bee are satirical news sites. I think actually our president may have tweeted something from Babylon Bee that he thought was a real story. And it's like, yeah, it's true. It's clearly like, it's like it's satirical. It's kind of like that with the book of Jonah. You know, Jonah is satire. Jonah is, you know, the height of satire. To read that as historical, is a historical text is to totally miss the joke. It's like pointing at an onion story and thinking it's telling you what's going on. So all of that to say, in these sections of Exodus, we're getting two genres, and it's hard to tell that if you don't know that. You might think you're just reading narrative, but there's actually an interplay between story and ritual as we go through these texts. And those two are going back and forth as we read Exodus 12 to 15. And so that'll affect the way that we read it. Because ritualization, of course, is the later understanding of what happened historically. So when we're reading the ritualization of some of this, it doesn't mean, you know, necessarily that people understood all of this way then, but we're seeing that later ritual reflected back on the experience of the people as they went through the Exodus text. The Exodus story. We see it right off the bat where there's an inclusio, if you all remember that fancy word. An inclusio is when you have the same thing at the beginning, at the end, and that kind of forms a narrative frame. So there's an inclusio of a powerful ritual in chapter 12, 1 through 27a, which is the ritual of Passover, that begins this story. And then the story of Exodus ends with songs of praise in 15, verse 1 through 21. So the inclusio itself is framing this section of Exodus as based in ritual and in worship. The liturgy is the lens through which we understand what God is doing in the Passover and Exodus narrative. And you see that right here with this chart I've gotten for you right here, where you can see that structure laid out a little more clearly. So you have Passover, little transition, story, transition, Passover, summary, firstborn, unleavened bread. There's some ritual material there, it seems. Story, summary, Song of Moses, transition, Song of Miriam. So there's actually only two stories in these four chapters. But those stories are enclosed by the entire sequence by liturgy, and each story is bracketed by liturgical remembrance. Does that make sense? And we'll move through and kind of see some of that in action, but I kind of want to just pull the camera back and show you the big picture of kind of the structure of what's going on in this section of Exodus first. So, all right. What else would I say? So this indicates the fundamental nature of the Passover liturgy. In and through this ritual in every generation is a recipient of the Exodus. And every era, God delivered us. When you read the story of Exodus, you're not reading something that happened to my ancestors. You're reading something that is still happening to me today. That I, as a Jew, participated in the Passover. Through the Passover ritual, that brings that moment present to me again. The fancy theological liturgical term for that is anamnesis, which is to make present once more. And that's what's happening in the Great Vigil of Easter. We actually are cribbing from the Passover liturgy. Because the great thing in the Passover liturgy is the question is, you always ask the youngest person, why is this night different than all other nights? And then you get the recitation of the Passover text. And that's what we do with the Exultet. When we celebrate Easter, we say, this is the night, the Passover, not this is the night we remember, but this is the night that moment of the deliverance at the Red Sea becomes present again. This is the night when Christ's victory over death through the resurrection becomes present to us once more. And if you've ever been to a good, great vigil of Easter, hopefully you've had that experience of presence, that you feel some sense of the power of that moment in the way the ritual is enacted, that it's definitely not a show you're watching, but the ritual is bringing you present into that once more. And that idea that because of the ritual of Passover, every generation experiences the Exodus. In every era, God delivered us. What you'll see as we read the rest of the Hebrew Bible is that that is formative for how the people understand themselves, that they return to this theme over and over again, that in our own time, the Exodus is made real yet again. So this is a really important point, theologically, liturgically, hermeneutically, and so that's why I'm kind of, drilling it home a little bit. Questions, comments, thoughts?
I have a couple of questions.
Please.
First, I doubt if Moses had a stenographer with him. So when were these things actually put down in writing? This is what he said, this is what he said. Was that during the captivity or some other, do you know that? And then the other question would be, when was the theology which you just explained established? I think it's very strong, but when did the church or whoever establish that as theology?
Those are two really good questions. So the first one, in terms of when was the book of Exodus actually written, the short answer is we don't know. It's very likely not written by Exodus. One of the great reasons being because it kind of tells the story of how Moses died, and it takes a real great author to write that story. Let me see what the annotated Oxford Bible gives for their suggested dating for the book of Exodus. One of the great things about a good annotated study Bible like this is the beginning of every book will give you kind of a thumbnail sketch of what most scholars think about kind of some of these basic questions. So generally people would assume that this would be the events that are happening are perhaps 13th century BC. So this is Ramses II is the pharaoh in question, is one way of looking at it. Others don't think that this probably actually does reflect a historical reality, but that instead this reflects the domination that Egypt had over the land of Canaan when the Israelites lived there, and that this story was kind of invented. So Exodus is a metaphorical reading. Those people would generally place this in the late Bronze Age. What else would I say? Some sections, there's also, and I should probably do an excursus on this in one of the future classes, but so in general, the documentary hypothesis is the idea that the first 5 books of the Bible had generally 4 authors, a Yahwist, the Elohist, the priestly source, and the Deuteronomist, each of which had very different intentions and each of which wrote their material at a different age. And that what happens in the first 5 books of the Bible is those 4 sources, J, E, P, and D, are edited together into a final form. And that the documentary hypothesis is a hypothesis. We don't know for sure, but it's also one that seems pretty clear when you look at this. There does seem to be some pretty clear structural seams in some of these stories. And Exodus has definitely some sections that are very priestly, very interested in the tabernacle. Some of them seem to be much more Deuteronomist in terms of that source. There also seems to be a prehistory of some sort in Exodus. So there's probably some ancient stories that had been circulated that are also put in here. And then there are also just like weird things. Like one of them that we're going to talk about next week is this really weird thing where like God gets angry and like someone cuts a foreskin off and like throws it at their feet. It's this bonkers story that makes no sense. And but it's because there's all of these ancient ritual texts and folklore all being kind of blended together into this. all of that to say, the best way to read it, I take it as the canonical approach. We talked about this before, that we just kind of accept the text as it is. Probably this was edited together, to answer your question though, Chuck, probably sometime either in the Babylonian exile or in the time immediately following the exile during the Persian period, was when this would have been edited together into somewhat like the book form we have now. That's a possibility. Some would argue for an earlier date. Some would argue that, that all of this was put together around the time of the reign of Josiah. That the discovery of the Torah was actually not a discovery, but was something that was finally written and put together. So there's a lot of different theories about this, but probably that. And I generally fall in the line of thinking that the way Exodus is put together is assuming the experience of exile and return, because there's so much of the exile and return narrative which is echoing the Exodus narrative that it seems to me there's a strong connection there. So that was your first question, and I got so caught up in that answer I totally forgot the second.
Well, I think it's a thrilling idea that we relive this through the Easter season, and Christ is the culmination, of course, of our Passover. But I don't know if there was ever a time when somebody said, well, this is now part of our theological teaching, or was accepted as a theological, or is it still something that's still developing?
Well, you see that in Judaism, certainly by the time of ritual remembrance. So most likely, the priestly source is the one that's very interested in the importance of the temple and of that ritual in the way that that connects us. So there's some connection there, but there's also some interesting connection with the Yahwist, where it's not the connection with the temple, but it's the significant relationship with Yahweh that forms us. So both of those sources you see beginning to understand the Passover nature in this way. So a lot of the ritual that we're reading in this text probably does come from that exilic time, where people are beginning to understand that one way that they survive the experience of exile is by practicing Passover in such a way that the Exodus becomes real to them once more.
Yet at the dating, there was a time, wasn't there, that celebration of the Passover fell into disuse. And I wonder whether telling this story about its importance could have been important at that time.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. That I think that wasn't that the reign of Josiah? One of his reforms was the restoration of Passover.
Yeah, I guess it had not been celebrated for centuries, or whatever the story is.
Yeah, and so that's a possibility too, that there's some reclamation going on later on that winds up influencing how we hear this text.
But that still doesn't nail down when our book of Exodus achieved its present form.
Correct.
Father Jared, several years ago, I had traveled to Ghana with a mission team from the Presbyterian Church to Presbyterian churches in Ghana. And when we got out of Accra into the smaller village of Sokogi Bagli, the small bus that we were on was met by this large group of people. And I'm looking, I was like, why are they wearing those costumes? And it turned out that they were reenacting the Exodus as we arrived. And that was, I didn't think of Christians having that connection to the Exodus until I had that experience. And it was very significant to them, and it made an impression on me that I still probably don't completely understand.
Yeah.
Do Muslims still recognize and practice the Passover rites?
No.
Oh,
No,
okay.
That would be a Jewish, but they do revere Moses as one
Right.
of the patriarchs. But yeah, they would have different. I was checking to see what else I could see in my notes about this question of source, and yet most scholars would in the modern time would frame this as a book that was written during the Babylonian exile, so this is the 6th century BC, based on earlier written and oral versions, and then that probably was the post-exilic Persian period that it was finalized in the 5th century BC. That's probably what's going on here, and there are some interesting connections between, just like with Genesis, we talked about this before, with Mesopotamian literature, with the Covenant Code and the laws of Hammurabi, other aspects of Mesopotamian literature that seems to be connected or echoed in some of the Exodus text too. All right, so that that's a lot of kind of opening stuff, but I was hoping that would give us kind of a sense of where we're at as we're kind of going into this text tonight. So all that to sum up, the historical event is the liturgical event. You can't separate the two, which really is annoying if you're a modernist and is rather delightful if you're a postmodernist. And I don't have enough time to explain that comment, so you're just gonna have to take me at my word. So I'm going to skip all of the plagues that we've had so far, that we already talked about last week, and we're going to move into the 10th plague, which is Exodus chapter 12, verses 1 through 30. And this is kind of a long reading, but I want to give us a sense of what's going on here, because it's a hard reading to break up. This is that first ritual portion of the narrative. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall mark for you the beginning of the months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. To the whole congregation of Israel, that on the 10th of this month they are to take a lamb for each family, a lamb for each household. If a household is too small for a whole lamb, it shall join its closest neighbor in obtaining one. The lamb shall be divided in proportion to the number of people who eat of it. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a year-old male. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, and then the whole assembled congregation of Israel shall slaughter it at twilight. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the lamb that same night. They shall eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted over the fire with its head, legs, and inner organs. You shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. And this is how you shall eat it. Your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat of it hurriedly. It is the Passover of the Lord. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human beings and animals. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague shall destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be a day of remembrance for you. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord. Throughout your generations you shall observe it as a perpetual ordinance. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses, for whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the 7th day shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day you shall hold a solemn assembly, and on the 7th day a solemn assembly. No work shall be done on those days, only what everyone must eat, that alone may be prepared for you. You shall observe the festival of unleavened bread, for on this very day I brought your companies out of the land of Egypt. You shall observe this day throughout your generations as a perpetual ordinance. In the first month, from the evening of the 14th day until the evening of the 21st day, you shall eat unleavened bread. For 7 days no leaven shall be found in your houses. Whoever eats what is leavened shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether an alien or a native of the land. You shall eat nothing leavened. In all your settlements you shall eat unleavened bread. Then Moses called all the elders of Israel and said to them, Go, select lambs for your families and slaughter the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and touch the lintel and the 2 doorposts with the blood on the basin. None of you shall go outside the door of your house until morning, for the Lord will pass through to strike down the Egyptians. When he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over that door and will not allow the destroyer to enter your house to strike you down. You shall observe this rite as a perpetual ordinance for you and your children. When you come to the land that the Lord will give you as he has promised, you shall keep this observance. And when your children ask you, What do you mean by this observance? Why is this night different than all the other nights? You shall say, It is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, for he passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when he struck down the Egyptians, but spared our houses. And the people bowed down and worshipped. The Israelites went and did just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. And at midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. Pharaoh arose in the night, he and all his officials and all the Egyptians, and there was a loud cry in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. We'll stop there. Long reading, but you can see how there actually seems to be two ritual observances blended together. A ritual observance of a feast of Passover in the first part of Exodus 12, and then a ritual observance of unleavened bread. And scholars think probably likely originally those were two separate festal observances that were joined in this text. And then following that, you get Moses' instruction to the people. And clearly this is a combination of things, because even in one part of it, it says, you need to do this because on this day I brought you out of Egypt. They haven't been brought out of Egypt yet. So clearly it's taking different texts and kind of pulling them together to do this. Other points I'd make is the blood does not have an apotropaic value, that is warding off of evil like magic. You know, that's not what the blood is doing. The blood is a sign, notice, first and foremost for you, 12:13, a sign for Israel. Only after that does God say, when I see the blood, I will pass you over. The point of the sign, though, is a sign for you, for the house of Israel. That's the first thing noted. And remember, as it is recalled in the ritual, when you do this, it becomes not merely remembered, but becomes present again. And most people think that originally, before the creation of the temple, that the Passover was actually celebrated in this way, that they would slaughter the lamb, they would put blood on their doorposts again, all of those would happen. And then what happens later when the temple is created is the slaughtering of the Passover lamb moves to the temple in Jerusalem. And it's no longer a household observance, but instead becomes a ritualized central observance that happens at the temple. But that's a development that happens. The original liturgy, I talked about this in my Maundy Thursday sermon, if you remember back in Holy Week this year. The original observance was household liturgy, household ritual. And you can get a little... it can get a little unsettling, this idea that all of these children are being murdered by the destroyer or God. And you can even see there's different ways. So in the first ritual remembrance, which is the ritual remembrance of the Passover, God says, I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. I will pass over you, but I will strike the land of Egypt. That God is doing these things. But then in another text, which seems to be from a different source, God says, for the Lord will pass through to strike down the Egyptians. When he sees the blood, and the Lord will pass over that door and will not allow the destroyer to enter. Who is the destroyer? We have no. Is the destroyer the Lord? Is the destroyer an angel of the Lord who God is holding back when he comes to a household of an Israelite? We don't know. But there is clearly a little bit of struggle with this idea of the destruction being wrought. But one way of remembering this is a truth, that the children bear the burdens of the sins of their parents, particularly the genocide of the Hebrew boys. Remember, that's how Exodus started, right? It started with the Egyptians committing genocide against the Hebrew boys. And so this is justice being wrought. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible sense, that sin must be answered for, that there must be a consequence to the 400 years of slavery and the genocide of the Egyptian boys, and that consequence is experienced in the Passover and the 10th plague. Questions, comments, thoughts? It's a powerful text. A lot of people believe that Exodus is the most important book in the entire Bible. That every book needs Exodus to make sense. It's kind of like the bottom of the Jenga pile. Every book relies upon the stories of Exodus to understand God and how God works in the world. And this narrative is part of the hinge that functions as the book of Exodus. So this is some of the most central scripture that we've read so far.
Just one little observation, and that is, it's looking to the time when the Passover will be regularly celebrated, and whoever eats what is leavened shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether an alien or a native of the land. So the congregation of Israel includes the natives of the land, but also the aliens.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And you'll see that function throughout as we'll see in the Exodus code and the Deuteronomic code as well, that there's a way of understanding the alien which is very different to the way we tend to think of immigrants. Good point, Father. Thank you for that. So the Exodus itself then happens as we continue with a shorter reading beginning in verse 31. So then Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron in the night, and he said, "Rise, go away from my people, both you and the Israelites. Go worship the Lord as you said. Take your flocks and your herds as you said, and be gone, and bring a blessing on me too." The Egyptians urged the people to hasten their departure from the land, for they said, "We shall all be dead." So the people took their dough before it was leavened, with their kneading bowls wrapped up in their cloaks on their shoulders. The Israelites had done as Moses had told them. They'd asked the Egyptians for jewelry of silver and gold and for clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have what they asked. And so they plundered the Egyptians. Some things to know about this. I would argue that this is making clear that the ritual observance of the festival of unleavened bread comes later than the Exodus story, because the way this is being framed is the reason they have unleavened bread is because they didn't have time for the dough to rise. It's kind of a part of, they had to leave so quickly, and then later that becomes ritualized into the festival. So like I was talking about, there's this interplay between what's actually happening historically and then how is that later understood in a ritual context. And this is a great example of that. It's later ritualized as a festival. When you get to the actual moment, it seems like simply a practical concern that they didn't have a chance to leaven their bread. Notice as well that this is in the middle of the night when Pharaoh summons Moses in Egypt and orders Moses and Aaron, that should say, and orders them to leave Egypt. It's to leave and worship the Lord. Because remember, the original request had not been free my people, liberate them, but let us go into the wilderness to worship Yahweh. And to which Pharaoh responded, I don't know Yahweh. And so even here at the end of the plague, Pharaoh is not saying, I am forever releasing the Hebrew people from slavery. He's saying, go ahead and go worship if it matters that much to you. So that's still the request we're catching here. That hasn't changed into a permanent exodus and a permanent liberation yet, which is an interesting point in the narrative that kind of shifts a little. Also, you get this weird moment where at the end of Pharaoh telling him to leave, he asks for a blessing and bring a blessing on me too. But there's no sense of Pharaoh's tone. Is he saying this because he's terrified of the action of God, of Yahweh, that he's hoping that he can get a blessing to protect him from this fierce God? Is he saying this sarcastically? You know, we don't know what his tone is, but there is that ambiguous request for a blessing. Yeah, Father?
Well, I'm just wondering how a person who happened to be a lector for this reading, how he would decide what tone to use.
Right. Yeah. If you ever wind up with this text, you got to really help us with that here.
Fortunately, it's not in the lectionary. I don't think it is anyway.
I don't think it is. And give me a blessing too, or yeah, give me a blessing. How do we read that? That's a good question. The Egyptians then hurry them out of the country, even giving them great wealth. So this is the great plundering of Egypt, which becomes an important theological motif, not only in Jewish theology, but also in Christian theology. There's this great argument that happened between two of the great fathers of the early church about whether or not the church should use Greco-Roman philosophy to understand theology and all of that. And one idea was, no, the church and the academy are totally separate. They're totally different things, and the church needs to be the church. And the other argument that was put forth was that, no, the church will plunder the riches of the academy in the furtherance of theology. And that was the view that won out in Christian theology, and it used this plundering of Egypt as its foundational analogy. That's just that has nothing to do with Exodus. That's just a bonus church history point. That'll be an extra credit question on the exam.
Show off.
And note as well that they I didn't get that far yet, did I?
Father Jared,
Yeah, please.
I listened to the National Council of Churches Unity program last week, and it had to do in part with reparations. And the ministers that were speaking referred to that passage from Exodus as justification for the descendants of slaves in our country seeking reparations today, that God saw to it that the Israelites received not plunder so much as they were looking at it as what they deserved after 430 years of slavery.
Right.
And they were seeing it as a reason to support reparations today.
Yeah, there is that sense of that this is finally just payment for their centuries of slave labor. The wealth of Egypt was gained on the back of the Hebrew slaves. So it's only fitting that as they leave, they take that wealth with them. Yeah, that's one of the most powerful arguments I find personally for the question of reparations from a theological standpoint. The other thing I'd noticed, to just skip ahead a little bit, is in because then we're not going to read all of this text, but in 1319 you find out as well that they take Joseph's coffin with them. We see this. Let me read it to you. So, like, skip back to where is verse 19? And Moses took with him the bones of Joseph, who had required a solemn oath of the Israelites, saying, God will surely take notice of you, and then you must carry my bones with you from here. So Israel has been preserved by God's providence in Joseph's life and beyond his death as well. So you remember that ominous ending of Genesis where Joseph is buried in a sarcophagus, an Egyptian coffin, so that they take Joseph with them. This boy who had been sold into slavery by his brothers and had this amazing rise to power and all of that. In the end, Joseph says, near the end of his life, he just wanted to go home, wanted his body to rest in Canaan, in his own land, the land that would later become the land of his own land, the land where they were strangers at that point. But that's I think an important theological point that you can easily miss because it's just that one verse, but that's wrapping up a significant portion of the story we've had so far. So then God baits Pharaoh. So we're going to jump to chapter 14. And then the Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to turn back and camp in front of Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal-zephon. You shall camp opposite it by the sea. And Pharaoh will say of the Israelites, they are wandering aimlessly in the land. The wilderness is closed in on them. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, so that I will gain glory for myself over Pharaoh and his army. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. And they did so. And when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the minds of Pharaoh and his officials were changed toward the people, and they said, what have we done letting Israel leave our service? So Pharaoh had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 picked chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the Israelites who were going out boldly. The Egyptians pursued them, all of Pharaoh's horses and chariots, his chariot drivers and his army. They overtook them camped by the sea, by Pi-hahiroth in front of Baal-zephon. So this is kind of like funny. So instead of taking the more direct route out of Egypt, God kind of plays a trick on Pharaoh. He said, go over here this roundabout way, kind of get yourself stuck by the water, and Pharaoh's going to think that you're lost in the desert and that you're ripe for picking, and that'll draw Pharaoh out. So this is a military tactic that God is doing. One of the common epithets for God or names for God in the Hebrew Bible is often translated as Lord Almighty, El Shaddai. It's also translated as Lord of Hosts. This is Lord of the Angel Armies. It's a warrior term for God, and that we're seeing God actually doing military tactics here, right? And God's purpose on this once more is to respond to Pharaoh's taunt. Remember what happened at the very beginning. God says to Pharaoh, Moses says to Pharaoh, you need to let us go. Yahweh says this. And Pharaoh says, I don't know Yahweh. God is saying, oh, no. Pharaoh thought he knew me with those 10 plagues and the death of the firstborn. Pharaoh doesn't know me yet. I will be known to Egypt. That God's victory will bring glory, and it will mean that not only will Pharaoh know Yahweh, all Egypt will know Yahweh, and that Yahweh is God, not just of this little tribal people, but that Yahweh is God over all peoples, the kind of supremacy of God. And also note this as well. Remember this question of who is Israel going to serve? Are they going to, Pharaoh wants them to serve Pharaoh and the Egyptians, but God wants Israel to serve God. Eved is that word for serve. And so once more we get that where Pharaoh says, I can't believe we why we let Israel leave our service. That's a theologically weighted term. That he's realizing that change has been wrought and he wants to put a stop to it. Egypt then brings everything to this attack. Every chariot repeated 14 times. Every horse or horseman repeated 12 times. So there's a massive repetition in the story to emphasize that this is an overwhelming force that God is sending against the Israelites. And then the deliverance occurs in beginning in verse 11. I'll start in verse 10. I think I didn't do that before. As Pharaoh drew near, the Israelites looked back, and there were the Egyptians advancing on them. In great fear, the Israelites cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing we told you in Egypt? Let us alone and let us serve the Egyptians. Get it? Who do we serve? Do we serve Yahweh or the Egyptians? They're even asking to return to service of Yahweh. For it had been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. But Moses said to the people, do not be afraid, stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to keep still. The Lord said to Moses, why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to go forward, but you, lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the Israelites may go into the sea on dry ground. Then I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will gain glory for myself over Pharaoh and all his army, his chariots and his chariot drivers. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I have gained glory for myself over Pharaoh, his chariots and his chariot drivers. The angel of the Lord who was going before the Israelite army moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from in front of them and took its place behind them. It came between the army of Egypt and the army of Israel. And so the cloud was there with the darkness, and it lit up the night. One did not come near the other all night. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. The Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went into the sea after them, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and chariot drivers. And at the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and cloud looked down upon the Egyptian army and threw the Egyptian army into a panic. He clogged their chariot wheels so that they turned with difficulty. The Egyptians said, let us flee from the Israelites, for the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. The Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots and chariot drivers. So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at dawn the sea returned to its normal depth. As the Egyptians fled before it, the Lord tossed the Egyptians into the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the chariot drivers, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. But the Israelites walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great work that the Lord did against the Egyptians. So the people feared the Lord and believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. So notice the Israelites cry out to the Lord. This is an echo right, of the beginning of Exodus when they cried out under their bondage. Only now that cry is channeled through Moses, and God responds decisively as Moses brings this to God. Also, this is the response Moses gives the people from what God says. Don't be afraid, stand firm, keep still, salvation. The Lord will fight for you. It's a fivefold message. And that fivefold message is one that will continue to resonate in the Hebrew scriptures in terms of how God functions as God protects and cares for God's people. As God is doing this, splitting the Red Sea, remember all of the Exodus narrative is a reaffirmation of Genesis. The whole book of Genesis exists so that the book of Exodus will make sense. So the creation of dry land in the midst of chaos, that's exactly what God did in Genesis 1, right? When he separated the land from the water. So God is doing that creative act once more. Chaos, the water is the symbol of chaos. God is dividing that. God is creating dry ground once more. So it's that creative power of Genesis. And the people respond to this moment of salvation in praise and an articulation of God's cosmic victory. And that's what we see later in chapter 15, when the song of Moses and the song of Miriam. And notice in those songs of praise how the bravery of the women at the beginning, you remember those midwives at the beginning who did not kill the Hebrew boys but saved them, is set alongside, is bracketed at the end of the story with another woman, with Miriam's song of praise at the very end of this section of Exodus 15:20 through 21. So there's a deep connection here between Genesis and Exodus, but also that lovely inclusio that exists that places these women as the people who are the brave, strong people who are following the will of God. And notice as well how what do the Egyptians say when their chariots are thrown into a panic? They say Yahweh is fighting for them. They know the Lord, right? That's very intentional. They now are recognizing who Yahweh is, who the Lord is. So the very thing God said he was going to do is now taking place. Question you might ask yourself: who's the main character? This is the thing. We all come to the story of Exodus, most of us, with people in our minds like Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments, or Val Kilmer's voice in Prince of Egypt, or pick whatever you want. Who's it seems to be the hero Moses against the villain Pharaoh. But if you pay attention to the words and the language of the text, you'll see a different story is told. The word Pharaoh shows up 103 times in the first 15 chapters of the book of Exodus. Moses, 136 times, so a little bit more. The Lord or God appears 207 times. The main character, the character driving this whole story, is the character of God. Whether it is God responding to the cries of Israel and raising up Moses, whether it is God predicting the obstinacy of Pharaoh and then ensuring that obstinacy continue so that God's true power can be known to Israel and all nations, that God is the main character functioning in this text, and everyone else is reacting and responding to the actions of God. Even when Moses and Pharaoh are doing something, and they show it's often that what they are doing is in response to something that God is doing. God is the character that drives this text, not Moses and not Pharaoh. God is the one strategizing the story, the main character in the story of the deliverance of the people of Israel. So, questions and conversation. Let me go back to my Zoom and stop my share and go to gallery view. Comments, questions, thoughts. Got a few minutes left.
In the notes of the Bible that I'm using, it makes a connection between the Egyptians drowning and how Pharaoh was killing the Israelite male babies at the beginning by drowning them.
Right, by throwing them in the water. Great connection, Nancy. Yeah. And that's one of the things I love about a literary approach to the Bible is when you read it like you read any good literature, this is really well written literature. Like you can see so many more connections and things that are drawn, like very important things being articulated by the author or editor of the final text. There's deep resonances in a lot of the structural stuff. Other
Jared, you wrote in one of your blogs recently about the every Egyptian family had benefited by the hardships placed upon the Jewish people. And so I've thought different times, that'd be a terrible thing, all those dead bodies in the, I think they call it the Reed Sea, maybe not the Red Sea, but man, that'd be a lot of bloated bodies at the end of the day, horses and people. But the fact of the matter is that everybody had benefited. Everybody was better off because of the hardships imposed upon the Jewish people. And that was kind of an important point that you had made in that blog. You recall it?
I do, yeah. It came out of a discussion we had in the lectionary Bible study, where I actually, what it reminded me of is Lincoln's second inaugural, a text I memorized for a class in rhetoric in college. And there's this great line in his second inaugural, and I'll go ahead and read the whole quote because it's worth it. So this is, if you know your history, Civil War is drawing to an end and everything, and how do we heal after this massive violence and bloodshed? Lincoln says, "If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South, this terrible war is the woe due to those by whom the offense of slavery came. Shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that this war continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsmen 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so it still must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." What happened in Egypt was the cost of hundreds of years of sin, and that cost has to be paid somewhere. And then I wondered in my blog if some of the unrest and violence we're seeing is because we have refused as a country to pay the cost of our own history of racism and slavery. And so that might mean some buildings are going to burn down. That might even mean some people might die, and that's horrible. But that's not God's fault. That is the fact that we have allowed a sin to fester in our country, and that we all share some culpability for it. And this kind of goes back to what Nancy was saying. This is, to me, one of the most theologically profound cases for reparations that exists, is that every single one of us who are white have something in our life that we only have because Black people were enslaved. We may have to dig a little bit in our history to know that, but that's fundamentally true. And this is why the Exodus narrative became such a profound narrative for slaves, for abolitionists, and for the civil rights movement as well. Because when you're experiencing slavery and oppression, how do you not resonate with this text? And this is why it's seen as such a dangerous text for people who have power, because this is not a text that's very friendly to people with power, right? Which is sort of us. So yeah, it's powerful stuff. It's one of those things that I would love. I love the lectionary, but every now and then I would love to do like a sermon series where I could take something like this and just preach slowly through this text, because it is just, there's so much richness in it. We're kind of at the end of our time, but I don't want to cut anyone off if anyone else had any comments or questions before we wrap up tonight.
Personally, I get a little bit of a shiver with the Passover story because I'm a firstborn son.
Right? Bye, Scott. We loved you. Yeah, it's scary stuff. I mean, this is, this idea that, that I made this joke when we were having a school board meeting and they were talking about banning books because of their content, and I was like, you better keep the Bible out of schools then.
Yes.
There's a lot of horrible violence and genocide and all kinds of stuff I don't want kids reading in the Bible. So this is but this is also because this is what the world is, right? I mean, this idea that, when you boil God down to this kind of inspirational figure that's meant to kind of make you happy, sort of the Joel Osteen variety of Christianity. I mean, that's not God. Our God is a God it's like the great C.S. Lewis quote in Chronicles of Narnia. Is he safe? He's not safe, but he's good.
But Jared, when I was a kid in Sunday school, they never drew pictures of all these bloated bodies along the seashore.
Right? Isn't that a visceral picture that it literally says their bodies were scattered along? Could you imagine what that would look? If you've ever seen someone that's died of drowning, it's horrible.
Gross.
I mean, this is a horrible experience that's being shown. But once again, but set that alongside of hundreds of years of slavery, and set that aside the death of the Hebrew boys and all of the horrors that these people have experienced. And you see why it is that this story we're talking about tonight appears again and again and again anytime the people of Israel and anytime Christians are trying to understand what's going on in our own time with God. This is so key and so central. So this has been a lot of fun.
Can I ask a real quick question, Jared? It's Lynn.
Yeah.
Would the rest of the world have heard about this? Just going back to they will know who I am kind of thing.
Yeah, there's probably a little hyperbole going on there. We don't have any records in the historical record of something like this happening, at least not at all on this scale. And that goes back to the debate about whether or not this actually happened, or something that was later kind of a story that became mythologized, but was not an actual historical terror. And scholars really differ. There are scholars who insist this has to be a historical event because it's so grounding for the people of Israel. I mean, it's the cornerstone upon which everything is laid. So how in the world do you make that up? Because you've got no faith. You got no religion unless this actually happened. This is the same argument I would make for the resurrection when people want to say that the resurrection is not a historical reality, but it's something that we kind of some mythology thing that we do. I'm like, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then what did all of this mean? If the children of Israel weren't saved in some form from slavery in Egypt, then what does their whole existence mean? So I tend to I've become a conservative on some of these points, and I tend to side with the more conservative standpoint. I don't think Exodus reflects a perfect historical retelling of the story, but I do think there must be some historical germ within it of an experience of slavery, and of an enslaved people that were set free by God, and that fundamentally shaped their understanding of who they were. But
the lessons are there, even if the story is dramatized to some degree.
Exactly.
God still delivers.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and that's what the people of Israel discovered. That's why they keep coming back to the story over and over again, is because this experience happens to them over and over again, as it does for us today, I believe. I mean, I think that in our own way, we're crying out to God to deliver us from a lot of things in our country right now and in the world. And so I read the story of Exodus with hopefulness, because it says that when we cry out to God, God responds, and that sometimes that's not pretty.
Amen.
Sometimes that's difficult. Sometimes that's hard. Sometimes it costs us to let go of things we wanted. God, I love the flesh pots of Egypt. Oh, it was so much easier serving. Like we often want God to set us free, but we don't want to necessarily let go of all of the prisons we've built for ourselves, right? But maybe the freedom God has for our country means we need to stop having some things that we're used to, so that a true liberation can be found. That's my sermon for the night. I already preached one earlier at the St. Luke Mass at 5:30. So the bonus sermon for Kenneth because he got both. Sorry, Kenneth.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to turn the recording off.
Okay, thank you, everyone.